Three students were spending the day together, and one of them exclaimed, "It's windy." And the second student said, "No, it's Thursday." And the third student in response said, "I agree. Let's go get a drink." What's going on here? Why did the second student think that the first student said it's Wednesday instead of windy? And why did the third student think that the second student said he's thirsty instead of Thursday? Well, the fact is, these three students are English language learners, ESOL students, and each one of them has a different first or native language. So as a result, each one has acquired a different set of phonemes, or a phonological system, since birth, and that results in their misunderstandings. By the end of this video, you should know what phonemes are. You should also understand that every language has its own particular set of phonemes. You should be able to recognize that there is a connection between the phonemes of a language and its written form. And finally, you should understand why phonemes are an important aspect of learning English as a second language. There are some 5,000 languages on the earth. Each language has its own particular phonology, and they have sounds that are different, vastly different from each other, but they also have many sounds that seem to be similar. Some of the sounds, though, in reality are not similar, and when they are confused, what happens is, at best, the student will have a slight foreign accent. At worst, there can be serious misunderstandings. Phonology, then, is the study of the sound systems of languages. Phonemes are the individual sounds in a language that actually make a difference in meaning. Psychologically, though, they are actually units of linguistic perception that we develop as we learn our first or native language. Phones are what we call the actual sounds. The phonemes are what the representation is in our mind. Consider two words in English, top and mop. Now, these two words, we know, refer to two different things. We know that because the initial sounds, the first sounds on each word, are two different phonemes in English. Top begins with the t phoneme, and mop begins with the m phoneme. By the way, we represent phonemes in writing by placing them between two forward slashes, as you see here on this slide. So, how exactly do we develop our own phonology, our own system of phonemes for our particular language? Well, the fact is, when a baby is born anywhere on the earth, that baby has the potential for every possible human language sound. So it's kind of like if you think of it as a bank of switches. All of the possible sounds are represented. Here you can see the vowels A, O, the consonants T, the double R that we find in Spanish, the R and L in English. The R with a raised DL, or flapped D, that's a particular sound that I'm going to describe in a moment. The Nye with the tilde, the N, and it goes on throughout all of the possible sounds in any given language. Now, as a child begins to listen to the language of his or her parents and those around him, he'll turn off some of those switches that don't correspond to sounds used in the language of that child's birth. So, for example, a Japanese child. That child's going to turn off the switches for the Spanish double R, the English R and L, the Nye in Spanish, but it's going to keep on the RDL sound. That sound is particular to Japanese. It's kind of a flapped D with an R and an L combined together. It's the sound that you find in words like ryokan or harajuku. That hada, that da, is actually the RDL sound, and when we spell it in English, we actually use an R, but it's not an English R at all. Now, if you think of an English baby, the English baby is going to do something a little different as he's setting his switches. He's, of course, going to turn off the double R of Spanish and the Enye in Spanish, but he's also going to turn off the switch for that RDL combination sound that you find in Japanese. And instead, he's going to keep on the R and the L switches that we recognize in English. So as a result, when an English speaker tries to learn Japanese, it's really difficult to learn how to produce that RDL sound and how to recognize it, because it's just not a part of English phonology. Now, in addition to an infant setting the switches, so to speak, and again, remember, of course, there are no actual switches in the human brain. It's just psychological perspectives, psychological concepts that we develop as we develop our first language. But in addition to those individual sounds, there are also sounds that in one system of phonology, in an English phonology, let's say, they would make a difference in meaning, but in other languages they don't, or vice versa. Two sounds that don't make a difference in meaning in English may make a difference in another phonology, and that's where you really find problems with misunderstandings and confusion. Consider these two words, top and pot. Okay? Now, they both have the t sound in them. Top has it at the beginning, and pot has it at the end. Try saying these two words, and say them perhaps in a sentence, like, he is on top of the world, and the pot is on the stove. Notice when you say these words, the T in top has a little puff of air right after it. Hold your hand in front of your mouth when you say the word, and say it. Top, top. You'll hear a kind of ta, ta. But the T at the end of the word pot doesn't have that same puff of air. Now, when we say it in isolation by itself, sometimes we do add the puff. We will overemphasize it and say pot. But in actuality, if you say a sentence like, the pot is on the stove, the T at the end of pot doesn't have the puff of air. Now, that doesn't make any difference in meaning in English at all. Whether we have the puff of air after the T or we don't matters little. But in some languages, that little puff of air called aspiration does in fact make a difference. In the language of Hindi, language of India, aspiration makes a big difference in meaning. Consider these two words. The first one, and I've represented the little puff of air with the raised H in the phonetic spelling of the words. So this first word, which means fruit, you would pronounce as pull. Pull. Hear the puff of air? Pull. The second word, which doesn't have the puff of air after the P, is the word moment. Listen closely and see if you can hear that I'm leaving that puff of air out of the word. Bowl. 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 It almost sounds like a B, and sometimes that's confusing for English hearers because we think it's a B, but it isn't. A B has voicing. Vibration added to the sound. A B would be like bowl, bowl. But I'm actually not voicing the P. Bowl, bowl. Now, in these two words, we've got some difference in meaning. Here's another set that really could make a big difference if you were trying to communicate to someone. The word cull is wicked person. The word gull means yesterday. So imagine if you were trying to learn to speak Hindi, and you're an English speaker, and you were trying to tell someone something that you did yesterday. Since you're an English speaker, and we always put the little puff of air after the initial stop consonant, which is like the K, we're going to usually say cull with that little H or puff of air or aspiration after the K sound. So when we're trying to describe something that happened yesterday, the person who speaks Hindi is going to hear us, and they're going to think we're talking about a wicked person. They're going to wonder, what in the world did you do with a wicked person? Because it's just really difficult for us to keep track of that difference in meaning that that little puff, that aspiration makes when you're speaking Hindi. Here's another example of how phonemes can cause some confusion. In Japanese and English, we have the sounds sh, the SH, and s, the S. Now, those sounds exist in both languages. However, in English, the two sounds are two different phonemes, as you can see by these two words. We have the word shore, as in the shore along the sea, and we have sore, as in my back is sore today because I did so much exercise yesterday. So they make a difference in meaning. But in Japanese, the sounds are variations of the same phoneme. We call those variations allophones. But what it means is that it doesn't change the meaning of the word. So in Japanese, we have a word shimasu. And if I, as an English speaker, were learning Japanese, and I made the mistake and said simasu with an S sound at the beginning, it's not going to change the meaning of that word. The only thing that's going to happen is the Japanese hearers are going to think, "Oh, isn't that cute? He has such a funny accent." But it's not going to actually affect the meaning. So sometimes the differences can cause a whole difference in meaning, while at other times it's not so serious. The final aspect of phonology that I'd like to talk to you about in this presentation, it's basically just an introduction to phonology, is the correspondence between phonemes of a language and the written form of a language. Now, of all the languages on earth, they all have an oral component. They have speaking and listening. But not every language has a written or a literacy component. Not every language has reading and writing. There are still some languages that exist only in their oral form. Literacy is very different. It's something that we have to learn. We usually go to school to learn literacy. So, keeping that in mind, do you recognize this word? It's not goatee. This word, actually, suggested by George Bernard Shaw, is a variation on the spelling of the word for fish. He suggested that if we used the GH from laugh, the O from women, and the TI from nation, we could put them together to spell the word fish. Now, of course, we can't because there are certain rules that affect how these letter combinations sound in what environments, but it is a cute joke. It only serves to point out, though, that in the English language, we really have more phonemes than the 26 letters of our alphabet can represent. In fact, in English, there are approximately 40 different phonemes or specific sounds that make a difference in meaning. It depends upon what dialect you speak as to whether it's 40 or 39 or somewhere around there, but it's around 40. But we don't have 40 letters. We have 26 letters. And so what we have done is at times we use combinations of letters to represent sounds, and sometimes we use the same letter for more than one sound. For example, the same letter may represent different phonemes, as in rose and lose. Both of those words are spelled pretty much the same, except for the initial letter. But you can hear the vowel sounds are different. In rose, we have an O. In lose, we have a oo. Gauge and laugh. Both of them have the vowels A-U, but in gauge, it's an A sound, and laugh, it's an A sound. Character and charter. Here we have the CH combination, but in one instance it's a K sound, and the other it's the Ch phoneme. And finally, with vowels, we have lots of variation. In all of the words you see there, they all have an A, but that A represents a different phoneme in each word. Father, we have the Ah. All, we have Aw. About, we have Apple, we have A. Any, age, A. All spelled with a single letter A, but all different phonemes. We also sometimes use different spellings to represent the same phoneme, as in these words, tower and sour. The phoneme represented is a diphthong vowel, ow, but it's spelled in the first word with an OW and in the second word with an OU. Next you see the phoneme K, but it's represented with a spelling using a C as in cat, a K as in Kate, CH as in character, and a Q as in critique. And finally, we have the vowel phoneme E, but it's represented with a variety of spellings. We have C as in the ocean, S-E-A, C as in I see you, S-E-E, seen, with just a single E followed by a consonant and another E, the receive E, which is an E-I, the E in thief, which is an I-E, and finally the E in machine, which is an I consonant E. So as you can see, we represent our 40 phonemes in a variety of ways, and so it's extremely important that we don't confuse the fact that phonemes are the sounds of English, not the letters in the alphabet. The letters and the combinations of letters are used to represent the sounds, to represent the phonemes, but there is not a one-to-one correspondence, at least not in English. Other languages, they're a little bit luckier. They have more of a correspondence. But in English, because we have so many words that have come into the language from a variety of different languages, the spellings just at sometimes seem not to make much sense. Okay, so we have talked about how we develop the phonological system and acquire the phonemes of the language that we are first exposed to when we're born. We set the switches, so to speak, of the language that we hear, that our parents speak, and of the language community into which we are born. We've talked about the fact that phonemes are the sounds in a language that make a difference in meaning between words, and the fact that sounds in one language can sometimes make a difference in meaning, but in another language those same exact sounds may not make a difference in meaning, and that this can cause quite a bit of confusion for language learners. And finally, we talked about the fact that letters of a language do not always have a one-to-one correspondence with phonemes. A single phoneme, as we've seen in English, may be represented by a variety of different spellings, and a single letter may actually represent several different sounds or different phonemes. Now I'd like to give you an opportunity to practice what we've learned. You see lists of words on this page. Each line has 4 words. 3 of the words have the same phonemic sound in them, and the 4th word has a different phoneme. Focus on the sounds, not the spellings, and you should be able to get them. I'll give you about 15 seconds to get each one, starting now with the first line. Did you get it? The vowel sound in taught is aw, while the others have an ow vowel sound. The vowel sound in so is an o, while all of the others have an oo vowel. This one was a little tougher because the TH in breathe uses your voice while the other THs don't. Breathe. For this one you had to look at the final sound of each word. Carried ends in a D while the others end in a T, like walked. In this series, the word R has an ah vowel, while all of the others have an eh. This one was kind of tough too, because butter has a duh sound. You don't actually say a t in the middle of butter. And in this one, the S doesn't always sound like the hiss of a snake. In easy, it sounds like a Z. Easy. Z. There are a lot of ways to pronounce O-U-G-H, In this one, it produces the vowel sound oo, while the others are aw. And here we see that C can sometimes hiss like an S, as in nice. And this last one, even though here is spelled like bear with an E-A-R, it's a different vowel sound. It has a long E sound. So what have we learned? Well, we've learned that each language has its own set of sounds, called phonemes, that make a difference in the meanings of words. We've learned that some sounds in English don't exist in other languages, and that some sounds in other languages don't exist in English. Each language has its own system of phonemes. The phonology of students' first languages may, and actually probably will, interfere with their production. They're going to say things they don't mean to say, and they may have a heavy foreign accent. This is because of interference from their first language's phonology. As they're acquiring English, they're trying to learn to reset the switches, so to speak, to correspond to the phonemes in English. But it's not just going to interfere with their production. They're not just going to say, I'd like a bowl of fried lice. It also can have an interference effect on their understanding. They're going to hear things that you didn't say. If you use a word with an Asian student that has an L or an R in it, and that student doesn't hear the context for the word, there's a 50-50 chance they'll get it wrong. Hearing, the understanding, the perception of the language is affected by the phonology of their first language just as much as their production is. Think about it. How can we help English language learners learn, acquire the phonemes of English? In the next video presentation, I'm going to examine some of the ways that we can help, along with the strengths and weaknesses of each of those ways. Thanks for joining me today. If I can answer any questions, don't hesitate to contact me.